Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to the 2023 Economic Forecast hosted by Lyons Companies in conjunction with the University of Delaware's Center for Education and Entrepreneurship. My name is Tim Lyons. I'm the Vice President of Client Services at Lyons Companies. My brother and I had to decide on who was going to do opening and closing remarks. I think my brother said something about how the more handsome and charismatic of the two of us should go first. He's doing closing remarks, so he's going to get a chance to take a shot later. For those of you who are attending for the first time or who might not be aware, this event was started by my father, David Francis Lyons Sr., for the purpose of informing the employees of Lyons Companies on the factors that are constantly changing in our economy, and so that they could better empathize with the how those changes impact our clients. Our event has grown from a small presentation with our employees to the 300-plus attendee event that we have today here at the University of Delaware Star Campus. The last couple of years we have hosted this event have been marked by significant events that have rocked the world economy. In 2020, the forecast occurred just a few weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic had reached the United States. And last year's forecast occurred on the exact day that Russia decided to invade the Ukraine. Hopefully this year marks a change in that trend, as I'm sure we're all very tired of those kind of surprises. With that, it is my pleasure to hand the podium over to our co-host, Carlos Estrada, Director of University of Delaware Center for Education and Entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us. And I know that the award recipient has been waiting for 2 years to get this award. We did not have an economic forecast in 2021, and last year we did it virtually. So let me begin. The James B. O'Neill Award for Excellence in Economic Education and Entrepreneurship was created to recognize an individual who has made substantial contributions to promoting economic, financial literacy, and entrepreneurship education. The selection committee includes the Dean of the Lerner College of Business and Economics, the Chair of the Economics Department, the Chairman and Vice Chairman, and one more member of the Delaware Council on Economic Education. The prior year's recipient, which is the 2020 recipient, Robert Glenn, and myself. This year's recipient's passion for excellence lies in improving the urban education system through philanthropy and through hands-on volunteering. And in fact, one of our first encounters was when she invited, in 2017, Professor Jim O'Neill and me to teach a lesson with her in Harlem, New York. Currently, our award recipient serves on the University of Delaware Board of Trustees. She funded the Fontana Family Graduate and Undergraduate Education Scholarships at UD to advance teaching and scholarship in urban education. She also established the Fontana Financial Literacy Fund to support the Center for Economic Education and Entrepreneurship initiative to assist in the development and implementation of the new Delaware Financial Literacy Standards. Now, let me tell you how significant this fund is, because what it did is allow us to hire a personal finance program coordinator for the entire state of Delaware, and that person, Gail Colbert, actually oversees one of our key programs, Keys to Financial Success, a course that is offered in high schools in Delaware and that is taken by more than 5,000 students every year. Additionally, through this fund, our graduates of the PhD in Economic Education program are able to continue their educational development via a postdoc at our center. And as if that was not enough, she recently supported our 50th anniversary endowment to ensure that the impactful work conducted by the Center for Economic Education and Entrepreneurship continues for the next 50 years and beyond. We applaud her passion for urban and personal finance education and are very happy to formally recognize one of our own graduates, UD trustee Donna Fontana, as the 2023 recipient of the James B. O'Neill Award for Excellence in Economic Education and Entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Carlos. It's truly an honor to receive this award from the center. I vividly remember the very first economics class I ever took. I was a freshman at the university, in my very first semester, Intro to Macroeconomics. I was fortunate to take the class during the time when I was in the honors program, so it was a very small class, allowing a lot of interaction with the professor. But even more memorable was the fact that my professor, Professor Hutchinson, had written the textbook that we were using. With his guidance, I fell in love with the logic of macroeconomics, the performance, structure, behavior, and decision-making of the economy. I learned to appreciate the interplay between output, unemployment, and inflation. I had never had such a rewarding educational experience before. And it's also why I'm excited to listen to the panel after this award. 30 years later, I found myself teaching a weekly class on personal finance to middle school students in an extended learning day program in East Harlem. We called the class How to Become a Millionaire, to increase the students' excitement and attention. We used very basic concepts such as saving, not spending more than you earn, budgeting, knowing where all your money is going, and investing, how to make more money. It was a complete joy to see the students get the concept of compound interest. You mean my money can earn money? When I was approached to support the Center for Economic Education and Entrepreneurship, I initially focused on my rewarding experience having taught financial literacy. The development team was in my office explaining the history of the center, including the fact that Professor Hutchinson had started the center. Well, now they had my attention. I had a flashback to my freshman year at the university. I stood up in my office and took from my shelf the very textbook that he had written on macroeconomics. Through multiple companies and offices, it was the one textbook that I took with me everywhere. Flooded with positive memories, it was an easy decision to support the center. When Professors O'Neill and Assorta asked if they could take me to lunch in New York to thank me for my commitment, I instead, as you heard, asked them to join me in East Harlem. My sixth grade students got to experience a class on free markets from two university professors. Well, not only two university professors, but two of the top economic educators in the nation. My hope was that my students would feel the same sense of excitement I had years before. And by the looks on their faces, they certainly did. This experience gave me a sense of the ripple effect that Carlos and the center are having throughout the classrooms in the state of Delaware. And that is why I'm so excited to support the center and honored to receive this recognition. Thank you again, and I'll turn it back over to Carlos.
So we're going to take a quick picture with Professor O'Neill, if you don't mind, and we'll turn it over then to Tim. So just give me a second. We have to make it work after she put us to work in East Harlem. So. Thank you. Thank you, Don.
So it is now my pleasure to introduce Nick Timmeros, Chief Economic Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Nick is responsible for covering the Federal Reserve and other major developments in the U.S. economy, in U.S. economic policy. Previously, Nick covered the Treasury market and U.S. housing and mortgage markets, including the government's response to the foreclosure crisis and its control of the federal companies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. He contributed to the journal's presidential election coverage in 2008 and joined the journal in 2006. Nick is the author of $1 Trillion Triage, which chronicles the U.S. economic policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nick.
All right, thank you very much. It's great to be back with you this afternoon. And we are going to hear from our three speakers first, and then we'll all be joined on stage for a question and answer session. So first, I'd like to welcome Patrick Harker, who's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. He has had that job since 2015. Of course, you remember he was the president of the University of Delaware before that, and was also a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So, Pat, I will turn the stage over to you.
All right, well, thanks. It's great to be back here at UD, it really is. And I had many, many happy years here as president, but I do recall one downside. The construction on 95 never, ever ends. Coming down, you experience that. But in all seriousness, it's really an honor to be here today, and particularly an honor that President and First Lady Asanas are here. Thank you for being here. So I plan to speak about the national economy, monetary policy, but I also want to talk about an exciting new initiative from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and then we'll get to the discussion and the other speakers. But before I do that, I have to give you the standard Fed disclaimer. So the views I express today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else on the Federal Open Market Committee or in the Federal Reserve System. So, you know, the last time I was here for this event was almost 3 years ago, again, February 2020. And if we take a step back and think about it, it's quite remarkable how much has transpired in that period. First and foremost, of course, is the humanitarian tragedy that our country and our world has endured because of the COVID-19 virus over the past 3 years. More than 7.5 million people globally have perished from the virus, including more than 1 million of our fellow Americans. This is a public health catastrophe on a global scale that is simply unprecedented in any of our lifetimes. The tribulations of the U.S. economy over this period have been startling as well. During the early part of the pandemic, the national economy suffered its largest contraction in recorded history as the virus spread and state and local governments shuttered businesses that they deemed non-essential. Tens of millions of Americans were thrown into joblessness in one of the sharpest recessions in American history. That downturn was followed by a period of extraordinary economic growth as states loosened restrictions and, with astonishing rapidity, highly effective vaccines against COVID-19 were developed and deployed. It really is quite amazing. But even as the economy came roaring back to health, the scars were visible. Many older Americans had opted to retire at the onset of the pandemic, leaving labor force participation below where it was before COVID-19 arrived on our shores. Supply chains were badly damaged by the virus itself as workers fell ill and government lockdowns which shuttered factories for extended periods. This left crucial items like computer chips in short supply. Meanwhile, large doses of fiscal spending from the federal government and, yes, accommodative monetary policy from the Federal Reserve stoked demand. This led to a phenomenon known colloquially as too much money chasing too few goods. That's in the textbook, Donna. And the highest inflation in 4 decades. And make no mistake about it, high inflation is a scourge, leading to economic inefficiencies and hurting Americans, all Americans, but particularly those with limited means. I find it particularly disturbing that life's true essentials, if you think about what people have to go through, life's true essentials like groceries, fuel, and shelter have skyrocketed in price. The Federal Reserve is absolutely committed to bringing inflation back to our 2% target. And we're doing this by adjusting our monetary policy. Last year, we raised the target for the federal funds rate to between 4.25% and 4.5%. That was a very significant move and a very fast one, given that we started the year at essentially zero. I expect that we will raise rates a few more times this year, though to my mind, and this is my views, the days of us raising them 75 basis points at a time have surely passed. In my view, hikes of 25 basis points will be appropriate going forward. Now, at some point this year, I expect that the policy rate will be restrictive enough that we will hold rates in place, just hold them in place to let monetary policy do its work. We're also shrinking our balance sheet, which is also removing a significant amount of financial accommodation in and of itself. Our goal is to slow the economy modestly and to bring demand more in line with supply. The Federal Reserve obviously can't fix problems like supply chain issues or an endemic shortage of workers, though it does seem these problems are starting to ease a bit. This is what we're hearing from contact after contact, and you see the glimmers of this in the data. But we can affect demand by making it more expensive to borrow money. That's monetary policy. And it is clearly already happening. We're seeing unmistakable signs of a slowdown in the most interest rate sensitive parts of the economy, like housing. And also, it's encouraging that even as we're raising rates and seeing some signs that inflation is cooling, and for example, the producer price index today is another sign that things seem to be cooling, the national economy, if you step back, remains relatively healthy overall. In parts of 2022, the economy grew modestly, even as we were tightening monetary policy substantially. Now look, although inflation is biting, many Americans are still spending, even if they have to dip into their savings to do so. We're seeing a healthy recovery in those sectors that suffered the most during the pandemic, like leisure and hospitality. While some sectors that build up healthy order books, like manufacturing, they are cooling somewhat. You saw that in today's data, and we see that in our Manufacturing Business Outlook survey from the Philadelphia Fed. I do remain concerned about commercial real estate, as the embrace of remote and hybrid work is clearly dampening demand for office space in central business districts and in suburban office parks. I'm most pleased that the labor market remains in excellent shape. Last year, the U.S. economy created 4.5 million jobs. While we are seeing scattered layoffs in certain segments like tech, there's little evidence of a major downturn in the job market at this point. In fact, a record number of Americans are employed. And indeed, the national unemployment rate is an exceptionally low 3.5%. But there's more good news. We are starting to see, again, inflation come down across a spectrum of goods. And so with monetary policy doing its work, supply chains healing, and excess demand running off, I forecast core inflation to come in around 3.5% this year. Again, this is core. I mean, headline with food and energy is very volatile. And I want to be clear. Well, it's great that we can get it to 3.5. It's not 2. And so we need to continue to do our work. But this is suggestive of clear movement in the right direction. Core inflation should fall to 2.5% in 2024 in our forecast, and then back down to 2% in 2025. In other words, it's going to take some time, but it is going to happen. Because of that, GDP growth will be modest, but I am not forecasting a recession. The labor markets are simply too hot to indicate a significant downturn at this point. So I expect real GDP growth of around 1% this year before climbing back up to trend growth of about 2% in 2024 and 25. Lastly, I do think we will see a slight uptick in unemployment, probably topping off at around 4.5% this year, before falling back to 4% over the next 2 years. It is an underrated advantage that the Federal Reserve is taking on inflation from a position of such strong labor markets. This is a very good thing for us that we have strong labor markets so we can affect inflation this way. So let me turn, in the remaining few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about an exciting new initiative from the Philadelphia Fed called the Anchor Economy Initiative. And it's fitting that we're actually convening here on the Star campus today, because this place exemplifies the Anchor Economy Initiative perfectly. The Anchor Economy Initiative seeks to quantify the economic impact of higher education institutions and hospitals, eds and meds, that we call anchor institutions, anchored in their communities. And I think this is vital work. Anchor institutions are often the largest employer in regions. They're the producer of talent that other businesses need, and they lay the foundation for durable economic growth. They also have characteristics that other institutions just don't. For one, even though they've made sizable leaps in their use of technology in recent years, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, higher education institutions and hospitals are physically embedded in their communities. In fact, that's one of the reasons we call them anchor institutions. Unlike corporate headquarters, manufacturing facilities, or sports teams that can pick up and move, higher education institutions and hospitals tend to stay where they are. Hospitals and higher education also tend to be labor intensive, meaning they are often among the largest employers in their regions. Eds and meds also serve as bulwarks against the ups and downs of the business cycle. Enrollment in colleges and universities, for instance, is actually countercyclical, meaning that when the economy slows, usually more people go to school, boosting anchor institutions. Hospitals are generally often recession resistant. After all, people require medical care no matter how the local economy is faring. All of which suggests that regions with strong anchor institutions may have more durable economies than those without. And in recent years, we've also seen anchor institutions take an increasing interest in building up the areas they serve. They are typically critical partners in community development initiatives. We've seen more hospitals and universities investing in neighborhood economic development, boosting local commercial corridors, seeding residential real estate development, and building neighborhood amenities. Anchor institutions' impact goes beyond the immediate. And that's the key point I really want to stress. Fundamentally, anchor institutions stimulate growth through innovation, commercialization, new venture formation, and talent attraction. In that sense, they drive long-term economic development and growth. But let's not sugarcoat things, though. Eds and meds are both being radically disrupted by technology, demographic shifts, and increasing costs. As I alluded to earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated both telehealth and remote learning. This has certainly created opportunities for health systems and universities to expand their markets, and they've done this here, for example. But it's also loosened the place-based nature of their services. Suddenly, these anchor institutions are, frankly, less anchored. Demographics are another downside risk, though with disparate impacts for universities and hospitals. With falling birth rates, fewer 18-year-olds are heading to college, and even fewer will enroll in the future, especially if immigration rates remain depressed, as they are now. This demographic shift is most apparent here in the Northeast and in the Midwest, which also happens to have higher concentrations of colleges and universities. That raises real questions about the viability of many of these institutions in the future and the impact that will have on their communities. On the other hand, aging populations, they will require more health care, boosting hospitals. Even here, however, the picture is mixed, as many hospitals have closed over the past several years. Meanwhile, the ever-rising costs of education and healthcare mean that more people may be simply priced out of accessing eds and meds altogether, which is both a humanitarian concern and an economic one. So that's why at the Philadelphia Fed, we've developed what we call the Anchor Economy Dashboard, a new tool that quantifies the impact of higher education institutions and hospitals on more than 500 regions across the country. And I encourage you, I know when I've given this before, people go right on our website, it's right on our website, and you can look at the data for this region. For each of these regions, the dashboard calculates the total number of jobs, direct, indirect, or induced, supported by local eds and meds institutions. Direct jobs comprise those employed directly by the anchor institution, doctors, nurses, college professors. Indirect are those working in fields that directly support the anchor institutions, like IT contractors supporting a hospital, for example. And induced jobs are those that are supported by the economic activity that anchor economy institutions generate. So one thing that makes the anchor economy dashboard is so neat is that it also calculates a reliance index for each region. The reliance index provides a summary measure of how dependent a regional economy is on anchor institutions. It adjusts the economic impact by the size of the regional economy and incorporates measures of impact in terms of employment, income, and gross value added. So for example, a reliance index of 1 means a region's reliance on anchor institutions is right at the national average. Below means it's less reliant, of course, and above it's more reliant. On a national scale, the dashboard clearly shows what I've been talking about. The economic impact of anchor institutions is massive. 9% of total U.S. employment, 6.3% of U.S. income, 8.1% of total U.S. gross value added comes from higher education institutions and hospitals. That translates to 18.2 million jobs, $1.1 trillion in income, and $1.7 trillion in gross value added to the economy. So let's turn here. For Delaware, our data support what I suspect a lot of us know intuitively. This state is quite reliant on anchor institutions. So while Delaware's total employment in eds and meds ranks 46th out of 50th in states and the District of Columbia, that is largely a result of the state having a small population. For Delaware, the reliance index we calculate is 1.23. In other words, Delaware over-indexes on eds and meds, and as a result, Delaware is 23% more dependent on eds and meds for jobs, income, and gross value added than the U.S. as a whole. So I encourage you to, and the other thing I'd add to this, because it's high doesn't mean it's good or bad. This is research that we'll be conducting over the years using this data, because in some cases, a high index can be a good thing, but in other cases, if you're a small community and your local hospital or local community college or state college closes, that could be quite devastating. So again, take the reliance index with a grain of salt in terms of what it is, but it's really interesting to explore, and there's more data there that you can explore to understand the impact. So again, I urge all of you to go to philadelphiafed.org to delve into the dashboard. Again, we have data for 524 regions across the U.S., and you can compare regions as well. You can compare this region to other regions in the country. So I think it's an incredible tool. So in closing, I'd like to reiterate my thanks for having me here. And I also want to reiterate that the one message, if there's one message you want to take away, is that we are strongly committed to getting inflation to 2%, and we will get it done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Next, I'd like to welcome Dan Mahaffey, who is with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. He manages their policy programs and serves as corporate secretary to their board of trustees. Dan is responsible for research on everything from cybersecurity and technology policy to international relations, government procurement, and political reform initiatives. Dan, I will turn the stage over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me back. Again, it has been that same 3-year period where a lot has happened. And I will caveat this with our think tank's caveat, and we use the Yogi Berra caveat, which is that predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. But looking back at what we've talked about over the past few years and what we saw with our domestic politics, one thing that we predicted in 2022 was certainly a red wave. And that became a red ripple as we saw factors of the economy, that dissatisfaction of the economy, and the emphasis on pushing back on Biden was lessened by the fact of both the Dobbs decision as well as candidate selection by the Republicans. In the aftermath of that, there was not a clear alternative, and in an environment where there was significant economic dissatisfaction, That didn't translate into votes because there was not that alternative. And as the Fed notes as well, when many people still have their jobs, that perception of the economy doesn't necessarily push into a major political swing. So as a result, Speaker McCarthy now has a very narrow majority. We've talked a lot about that. We saw that in the 16 votes it took for him to get the speakership. Michael calls it the row of no that we saw up there. But they have now said that they are going to use the power they have with this narrow majority to get their agenda done. A lot of our attention will be on the House. We'll focus on that. But we also cannot forget the environment that will require anything they do to get through the Senate. You still need to get through the Senate filibuster. It'll still need to be signed by President Biden. So what you have are a lot of candidates who certainly have ideas, strong ones, and some would actually say maybe some of them have even helped Congress work better in some ways. But they have set us on a path for brinksmanship for many of the things that we consider important for the economic agenda, government spending, and particularly the debt ceiling. This idea that we could now have a default once the unthinkable is something that we now talk about in terms of 40 or 50% probabilities. The issue for the Republicans and their agenda will be, if you go talk to them and I ask them, the question is, do you want to have accomplishments to run on in 2024, or do you want to stymie the Biden administration and drag them down? And right now, the answer I get from them is yes. The challenge for them will be, what do you have to do to pick and choose of that? What are the American people going to want to see in terms of real action on things like inflation, on addressing the deficit, the widespread agreement in the public as well as in our politics about the competition with China? All those things demand real action that the American people want to see. On the other hand, the dynamic still within the Republican base and much of the Republican Party is to push back against the administration, to be a party of no, and those are the two forces that I think are going to come together in the brinksmanship and partisanship that'll come up to the debt ceiling. Now, a lot of this is some things where we, okay, historically the U.S. has never defaulted. What is that going to mean? And I'll leave that up to our discussion with those who have more financial expertise about this. But we also know what the warning signs are. We've seen when the rating agencies in 2011 downgraded U.S. debt. But we've also seen how Congress has dealt with these types of things in the past. And I'm going to go on a limb out here a little bit like a political weatherman. And I believe that we will face some kind of a default crisis this year around the debt ceiling. But it will operate in a very Washington fashion, and the lesson I hearken back to the most is the 2008 financial crisis, where Congress first turned down the bailout packages, the markets responded, and then once the Dow was down how many ever thousands of points, political orthodoxy went out the window for what needed to be done. Now we can get into the various ways that this could come about with the, is it a matter of Speaker McCarthy being willing to sacrifice himself for a deal in the end? Is it some kind of move where moderate and Republicans and Democrats come together? That could happen, but it takes longer. What I do see, though, is that we come to some kind of forcing point, a Friday night crisis, as Washington has done, as we often do with shutdowns or things like that. The markets respond, and then after a few days, 72 hours, something will be done, and I think we'll follow Winston Churchill's advice that Americans do the right things after exhausting every other option. That said, though, the damage that will have to the full faith and credit of our debt, the interest rates we pay, the perceptions of the U.S., all of those things we need to consider, because that, I think, fits into the global challenges we face. And those are certainly ones that are more complex and will weigh on the scene as well, particularly, though, as President Biden, facing a divided government, looks more and more to the overseas foreign policy as presidents do. Where we see him continuing, we'll talk about the war in Ukraine, of course, but I want to focus first and foremost on the competition with China. We have had now, and this is bipartisan, a 365 to 65 vote created the House Select Committee on Competition between the United States and the Communist Party of China. There is bipartisan agreement on that, and we will continue, I believe, to see the growth of a technology Cold War. The Biden administration has clamped down on the commanding heights of semiconductor technology, and they want to continue to do so working with allies and partners. That continues to create a pressure on the economic relationship between the United States and China, and one that I will only think will deepen as there is also pressure on the private sector to diversify their supply chains away from China. And I think the Financial Times pieces we've seen about Apple recently clearly lay out the challenges they're having. But policymakers will also need to understand that this is not like playing Sim City. You can't just plop a factory down or drag a road. These take years, decades to build these supply chains, and China's position in our global supply chains certainly is going to be hard to extricate. So this challenge of a Cold War while dealing with economic interdependence remains. On the front with Moscow and the war in Ukraine, certainly one that we have seen a return of the unthinkable in the types of warfare that you would imagine is World War II or that era. And what we've seen is not only how American and NATO high-tech weaponry has helped the Ukrainians turn the edge. At the same time, though, it is a reminder that the future of that conflict comes down to attrition, building artillery shells, getting enough men and munitions to the front. These are things that we as a country, and our allies as well, have largely forgotten. We don't make artillery shells. We don't make the missiles. We don't have the defense industrial base that we once had. So how is that a wake-up call, one, to our investments in those industries, but also how we look at the future of that conflict in terms of the balance of our support and where we go from there. Around the rest of the world, as this competition grows, I do have to say most of these countries, and I don't blame them, are going to try to get the best they can by playing Washington, Beijing, and Moscow off of each other. If you were any other smaller country, that's what you should be doing. And we have to then understand, not just through force of arms, but how do we make our system, our goods, our technology, the more appealing model than that from Russia or China. So I know there'll be questions. I'll leave a lot that to the panel, and I'll close again with Yogi Berra because the future just ain't what it used to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And our final speaker and panelist this afternoon will be no stranger to regular attendees of this event. Michael Farr is the Chief Market Strategist at Hightower Advisors, and he's the founder of Farr, Miller & Washington, LLC. He is a frequent commentator on CNBC and other business news shows, and he is the author of 3 books. Please welcome Michael Farr.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be back here. Thank you very, very much. What a treat. And one of the great things that I'm able to do with President Harker and Professor Acerta and the Lyons families and all of you, somehow I'm kind of watching the gray hair increase just a little bit, a little more than we had 12 years ago or so when I first started this with Jim O'Neill. Great fun. All right, I'm going to do something with great trepidation. I'm going to disagree with President Harker for a couple. I'm sorry. It's not the first time. And look, if you're going to believe one of us, I mean, come on. Okay. Rain dances and other negotiations. Let me just tell you about rain dances to start out with. We are going through a period of drought. The economy is strong, but we're fighting this inflation. And it is insidious, and they do have to tame it, and they're doing the right things. Markets are very upset because they're used to having the Fed on their side. The Fed's supposed to step in when markets go down, when things get tough, and make it all nice, nice again. The Fed keeps trying to be clear that that is no longer their role, and markets won't believe them. And in the weeks so far, in front of every Fed meeting, there has been some new narrative, wild narrative that's developed as to why this meeting is going to be a lower hike than previously announced, and that the Fed is going to pause or the Fed is going to pivot, and the tech stocks go up because they need that low cost of money for those discounted present values and cash flows as they look to the future. And the risk trade comes back on, and then the Fed comes out and does exactly what the Fed told you they were going to do. And markets get very upset, and they go straight down, and they blame the Fed. And then you get a professor here to, okay, I'm going to pick on him. Jeremy Siegel has been coming out against the Fed, and I have disagreed with Professor Siegel for a while, saying that the Fed has done too much. Now, he may be right. In the long run, he may be right. And they may have taken such action so far as to ultimately cause a recession. I think that's going to happen, and that's the key point. Now, imagine for 1 second if President Harker stood up here and said, yes, I think we're going to go into recession. There are certain things I can say that he really can't say, okay? I can't. So, and when you see this inversion of the yield curve that we have right now, this 3-month to 10-year yield curve, hang on, I wrote it down, because I can't remember stuff anymore, so I did write it. The 3-month, the 1 month Treasury is 4.45, 1 month, 4.45. 10-year is 3 3/8, right? 4.45. So it's over 1 full percentage point. You get paid full 1 percentage point more on the 1 month as opposed to the 10-year Treasury. 100% of the time that's happened before, we've ended up in recession. So let's go with that. I mean, instead of, let's see if this will be the one time where it doesn't happen. And in fact, the Fed has said that ultimately a recession is an acceptable consequence in order to bring, if that's what it takes to bring inflation under control, but we're going to bring inflation under control. So I'm clicking and it's not doing. Let's try it. It's not. Okay. All right, can you advance the slide? This isn't. All right, so inflation, the Fed's doing a good job with inflation, and we're seeing numbers come down, and markets continue to believe that the Fed's going to be successful. Fed's tightening, I think, is likely to cause a recession. And even though stocks have pulled back, I don't think they're cheap relative to history. High profit margins and overly optimistic earnings estimates argue for a defensive posture. There we go. Hey, maybe this worked. Did I do that? All right, we'll go with that. So, see, these are the two measures of inflation, CPI and the PCE deflator that the Fed looks at. Peter Lynch says any 8th grader can read a chart, right? Is it going up or is it going down? Well, this one looks like it's peaked and rolling over, and that's really good. But what President Harker has said, I hope I get this right, there we go, is they want to get it back to here. That's where they're going. So this is good news, and the markets get all excited about this. The average, Joe Bag of Donuts out at Walmart has no idea about any of this stuff. Isn't paying any attention. He's paying actually attention to the price of a dozen eggs, and they care when you're at Walmart that butter is now $6.75 a pound. $6.75 a pound for a pound of butter. Dozen eggs, you can get up to $7 in some markets for a dozen eggs. This has got to get down here, and those prices have to stop going up so quickly. Some of these prices, President Harker, when he and I had the privilege of being here and asking him some questions a few years ago, and I have in the past, he was not a big, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, not a big proponent of this transitory thing, okay? Inflation is inflation and needs to be dealt with, was more what I remember him saying. But we have seen some things come down. These are supply chain issues, some of them with commodity issues and so forth. Lumber and shipping have come right back down. There's nothing that the Federal Reserve can do to affect lumber and shipping. You can't affect a supply chain problem here. Wage growth has accelerated significantly, and wages go up, and people go out and spend more, and they drive the prices of goods up, and then those prices go up, and they go home and they say, I still can't afford as much, so they go to their boss and they say, I need more, I need to get paid more, and there are fewer workers available. There are 4.7 million more workers, more job openings than there are people who call themselves unemployed. 4.75 million more job openings than people who are looking for work. So what do you do then? When you have 4.75 million more job openings, you're going to pay people more. And as you start paying them more, that hurts profit margins, hurts a bunch of things. Are the Fed's hikes destroying some of that demand? Are they making stuff so expensive in a certain way or by changing the cost of money to destroy the demand? I think they are seeing some effects. I think it's starting to work. He says they have more work to do. And let me tell you, Wall Street or anywhere else, if you're going to believe the Fed when they tell you something, believe them when they tell you they're going to stay with this. It's been a big mistake. So the consumer, I think, is running out of wallet. I listened to another presentation this morning saying, consumer's fine. Savings rate is now near record lows. Household debt has gone way up, and you can see everything from mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, student loans, all up there. Trillions and trillions. U.S. debt, we're hitting the debt limit, over $31 trillion. 31 trillion. U.S. GDP, 24? 24 trillion. Goods and services, sums of goods and services, and we've got 31 trillion in debt. Reinhardt and Rogoff did the study years ago, over 200 years in 70 different economies, and said anytime debt to GDP equaled 100% or more, you begin to trim 1% prospectively off of prospective GDP growth. You start to take too much of your resources to service your debt, right? So you start losing some of that growth. So look at the credit card number. Where is it? There we go. Credit card number. Credit card balances have soared. Now, if the consumer had all of that in savings, you wouldn't see those credit cards soaring. And by this way, the average rate on a credit card now is close to, right at 24%. 24%. 24%, really. And according to your credit card contract, it can go up to 30, and I think some of them are over. But it makes me crazy when I think of people, the people who can least afford inflation, and that's what President Harker was talking about. People who can least afford these higher prices are the people who really get nailed. And they get nailed like this. And they feel better, don't they, because they've got a little more money in their checks, and they go, well, I'm making more money. I know I'm making more money at work. The more money you're making hasn't increased as much as the price of butter and eggs. Stock prices have grown much faster than the economy, okay? So S&P 500 earnings are the blue line, and nominal GDP is the orange line, but you can see what stock prices have done. Are they going to come together a bit? I think they're still high. I'm going to move fast. Valuations have come down significantly, even as earnings expectations have yet to fall. What do I mean? I mean still over here, that blue line is the 2022 estimate for earnings, and 2023 estimates are up here, still higher in dollar amounts. That that's not consistent with a recession. That's not consistent. You see pressures on profits when you see the costs of inputs, including labor, go up. So S&P 500 margins have been high. Labor's been cheap. Interest rates have been low. We can borrow, if you're a U.S. corporation, you could borrow money at 2% all day long. You could do stock buybacks. You could build whatever you want. That money was cheap. It's not cheap anymore. And if you raise that debt in order to do your buybacks, that debt's still on your book, and you're going to have to refinance it. And you took it on at 2%, and now he's charging you 4% for money. And he might charge you 5%. And what's that going to do to your profit margins when you have to pay that in interest? And what about when you have to pay those workers more? It hurts a little. So when we look at profits and when we think of recessions, we know that they typically contract. I'm going to show you that in just a second. These S&P 500 margins are higher than the average, and it's mean reverting datum. So earnings typically fall around 20% during a recession. The current consensus estimate was for gains of 6% 2022, gains of 5% for 2023, and gains of 10% for 2024. How does that happen if you're seeing your margin contract, if you go into the recession, and if you have a recession that's been predicted 100% of the time and the other stuff? Look, I'm going to give you some good news. I don't want to send everybody out to the nearest bar here by the time I finish. I do have good news before the doors open. President Harker is looking at me like, yeah, well, get to it fast, will you? Because you're killing it here. And I get that. Before I give you the good news, I gotta stick with you for a minute here more on bad news. These people took 16 votes to do what everybody knew what they were going to do. And they said no, and they said no, and they said no. And they drove home the point, and they have this very narrow majority, and just a couple of people can stop the whole process. And they want to plant their flag in the ground and say, no, we're not going to pay for that. No, we're not going to agree to increase this debt limit until you all agree to that. This brinksmanship, they've proven they have no problem with the brinksmanship or the reputational fallout from the brinksmanship. What I don't think they understand, and I really don't think they understand, the real consequences to our country and our country's reputation and our economy. Look, he's trying to fight inflation and get us back after a shutdown and after a pandemic and everything else. You're going to put this on his back too? Really? I mean, we're going to have a default in the U.S. debt? How is the Federal Reserve supposed to keep enough liquidity in the system if a panic occurs over some sort of debt default? And Greg Valliere says 40% chance. Mahaffey says 50% chance. It won't last very long, I don't think. And we've gotten through this before, but 2011, these people were getting along and making nice compared to what they're doing in Washington now. Okay. I want to tell you, here's my good news. In the next 12 or 24 months, this stuff is over with. It's over with. The recession, if we have one, 12, 24 months, it's gone. The Fed tightening cycle, President Harker says 12, 24 months, end of, somewhere in 2024, they're done. This is going to pass. We're going to get through this. We've done this before. So, so far, all of those predictions that I've listened to through my 36-year career as an investor and helping people manage their money, all those predictions for the imminent end of the world have fallen a bit short. Haven't happened yet. I think we'll probably not end this time. And if we do, who cares? But, really, no, it won't matter, will it? So, don't get too much in a twist, okay? Okay, could we go through a downturn? Could we see markets go down further? Yes. Is it going to be forever? No. So don't do something stupid because you get scared. Just look at that long term. And this left-hand chart says, this goes back to 2000. So since 2001, I guess 2000, if you've stayed invested, you've had a 7.5% return. If you missed the top 10 days, you've had a 3.4% return. And 20 days out of those 20 years, you've had 0.1%. Now, on the flip side, people will come and argue with me and say, well, what if I missed the 10 bottom days? And wouldn't that have been good? I'd have been out of the market for those too. It's a valid argument. But you've got to time it right. And I've never been that good. Never known how to time it right. No idea how. I stay invested. I stick with it. I let my money work for me. I let it compound. Listen to Ms. Fontana. Listen to her. Let the money compound. I get excited about that too, by the way. It's not just your sixth graders. So don't bet against the U.S. This is a free capitalistic society. Innovation's rewarded. We have a stable we have a government, damn it. We have strong contract and property laws. We have an educated workforce. There are great advantages here. Inflation and interest rates, even as they've come up, are still very low. And we have a competitive tax rate. This is the right place to be. It really is. We will get through this together. I don't think the tough sledding is over with. And look, just because we're in this period of drought, you get a lot of people who want to tell you why it's going to be over with quickly. Well, you get in a period of drought, you get a bunch of people who want to start doing rain dances. What I've learned about rain dances is that the timing of the rain dance is a lot more important than the quality of the dancer, right? Do the dance at the right time, everything works out fine. You're not going to rush this. The Fed can't rush this. They'd like to make it go quickly. Not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that the world's ending, and we're going to get through it, and it's going to be okay. And I'm so happy to see so many familiar friends and faces again this year. Thank you all so much for having me, and we're going to do our panel discussion. Thank you very much. You come over here. Perfect. I told Nick I was going to interrupt with some questions for him, too.
All right, well.
He didn't really agree, but.
No, I'm happy to take questions. And we have questions that are coming in, I think online or from the audience, which we'll get to in a minute. First of all, it's great to be back in person. I don't take for granted these events anymore. So thanks for all of you for joining us today. Pat, I want to start with you on one thing you said in your comments, which I'm sure the markets will pay inordinate attention to, which is your preference to step down the pace of rate increases here. I think you said 25 basis points would be appropriate going forward.
Right.
And I want to ask you, what is it that you see now for people who don't follow every move? The Fed raised interest rates by 50 basis points in December. The previous 4 increases before that were 75 basis points. Before June, the Fed had not raised interest rates by 75 basis points at a meeting since November of 1994. So last year was a banner year in terms of getting interest rates up. And Pat, you're a voting member, of course, of the Federal Open Market Committee this year. So you'll be voting at that next meeting on January 31st, February 1st. Why is 25 basis points now the appropriate run rate for policy tightening?
So as I think about this, you think about first, what's the end game? Where are we going to end up? And I think somewhere north of 5, and I think the data have to tell us what north of 5, but we need to get north of 5. But we are starting to see things work, as Michael said. We are starting to see inflation coming down. I look at, again, today's PPI report and other reports. We're just starting. So I think there's a risk management approach here where we need to be prudent and not, I think about once you're getting toward where you need to be, I think about being in a dark room. This is a bad analogy. But you're in a dark room and you're trying to feel for the light switch and feel for the wall. You don't smack into the wall, right? You start to slow down and you start to get there and feel around. And that's where we are. We don't know exactly where it is, let's be clear, because we need to let the data dictate that. But we're getting near where we need to be. We're moving in. So I think it's just prudent at this point not to just rush up the hill and then possibly have to go straight back down. Let this work.
And on the inflation outlook, when you submit those projections every quarter, you and your colleagues fill out whether you think the balance of risks are tilted to the upside. That is, you have a projection for inflation. You said about 3.5% for core inflation at the end of this year. But then to try to provide a little bit more dimension to that, you and your colleagues put down whether you think the risks are that inflation will come in higher if you're wrong, or if the risks are that inflation will come in lower. How do you see the balance of risks around the inflation outlook right now? And how has the balance of risks to your outlook changed over the last 6 months?
Yeah, if I step back a little bit and I think about the inflation story, because I think you have to think of the story. What caused the inflation? Well, some of our colleagues in San Francisco and elsewhere tried to figure out what is the cause of it and take 2 buckets, supply chain driven, demand driven, right? And in the, roughly it's 50-50. I mean, the estimates vary, but roughly it's 50-50. This stuff, the supply chain stuff, we can't really affect. I mean, you talked about the price of eggs. Why is the price of eggs so high? It's not necessarily the demand for eggs, right? It's avian diseases, which this university is a world-class expert in avian diseases and poultry. This place knows this thing, and that just comes out of the blue, right? In the sense that, so it is actually shocking, given crisis after crisis now, droughts and floods and drying up Mississippi River and world conflicts, and that we keep chugging along. I mean, I like your last slide. This is quite an amazing country, right? That we continue to do this despite all these things. So if you take that, we can't control this part. So there is a risk to the upside on inflation because something else could hit it and really affect. There could be another, especially on the headline, another spike in energy because of something else Putin does, which is another tragedy he could create, and given the one he already has. But I think on the demand side, we're seeing things work. So I have to parse it out when I think about risk. This is uncertain, so the risks are high. Here, I'm increasingly confident that we're getting the demand side under control. Particularly, as Michael said, and you look at household balance sheets, and low, moderate income people are really starting to struggle. I mean, just signs of that. We're starting to see signs of it. So I think we need, but this is where people, and there are Fed critics, a few, no, there's a lot, and there's a balance that we're trying to meet between employment and inflation. And who gets hurt most by inflation? Well, it's these people we're talking about, the lower income people. Who gets hurt most by unemployment? The same people. And so it's that balance. So I think that's a long-winded answer to my risk on inflation is still up high, not dramatic, because again, this part is, the supply part is. Less so on the demand part right now, increasingly.
Michael, I want to ask you to jump in here. I mean, you showed the chart showing the peak in headline inflation. How do you see the risks around inflation for 2023?
I think they're heading in the direction that Pat says they're heading in. I mean, it's happening. We've seen something of a straight line. So I always expect that things never go in a straight line, and so I'm expecting one of those new pieces of data is going to come out, and it'll be a bit of a shock, and the markets are going to go, oh, but that's what markets do. When you said 3.5% for this year, and 2.5% in 2024, and 2% at target in 2025, I sit and think, wow, that sounds pretty dreamy. But Wall Street continues to say, you all are going to pause, and a pause is just wonderful prelude to pivot. We're waiting for you to pivot. We're waiting for you to start easing again. We're waiting for you to return that punch bowl, and we want to start making money on Wall Street. And you're really a killjoy. But you're telling us, I mean, if what you say is right here, we're not looking for the Fed to start cutting rates for another 2 years. Is that right?
I mean, we'll see. I mean, we could start sooner than that and easing back down. Again, I don't think we go scream up and scream down. So, but yeah, I think it's going to be a while. I think we get north of 5. Again, we can argue whether it's 5.25, 5.5, but we sit there for a little.
How long is sit there for a while?
We gotta let that. I mean, the data dictate that to see how fast inflation is coming down.
So, Michael, there's a disconnect between the markets and the Fed, and Pat can tell us where the Fed is. I'm going to ask you to speak for the markets here. Because the markets, if you look at inflation-protected Treasury securities, other market-based measures of inflation, investors are betting on inflation coming down faster than Pat does with his 3.5% core PCE projection. They are penciling in, as a result of that, interest rate cuts, some probability of higher probability of significant cuts in the second half of the year. So what's going on there? Is the market more pessimistic than the Fed in that they just see a recession and so you put more mass on cuts? Are they more optimistic on inflation? How do you explain this disconnect between, so-called disconnect between the Fed and the market?
There's a great book that I read a number of years ago by an philosopher economist named Hightower called When Wish Replaces Thought. And that's kind of my answer. I think wish is replacing thought. I mean, so I manage other people's money. And so I went to a Jesuit high school where they convinced us all of us were likely going to hell. And at my age, when we talked to our parents, they thought the Jesuits were right and might be going easy on us. So this.
I went to a Jesuit high school. I missed that part. I guess it changed.
You're younger.
Yeah, okay.
You see, I learned a lot of good things there, but the one was what I do for a living and talk to people about is a moral obligation. This is a sacred obligation. They taught us about heaven and hell, and we believed them. I can't mess up when I talk to a client. Yes, I've got some big clients with hundreds of millions of dollars, but I talked to a guy last weekend he called me and he was scared about his portfolio. This was a school teacher. He's retired in Tennessee. Absolute true story. He called and said, I had at the peak maybe $1 million. We're doing great, he said. We're doing great. I had $1.5 million in my portfolio. We're down 18% last year. I'm down at about $1.25 million, just a little bit above $1.2 million. I said, tell me about your other income. And he said, well, we have Social Security. I've got an annuity. I said, how much does the annuity pay? He says, the annuity pays us $32,000 a year. I said, okay. So $32,000 a year from an annuity. Social Security, he and his wife get both of it, somewhere north of $35,000 a year from Social Security, takes 2 or 3% from his portfolio. They've got $100,000 a year, sort of an income from there. And he said, should I raise some cash? Should I get more defensive? I said, where's the money now? He said, 50% in stocks and 50% in bonds. And he was scared. This is the greatest, I'm sorry for such a long answer, but this is the greatest privilege of my life, that I'm able to enter in these intimate moments with people and say, all right, look, you've got a 50-50 portfolio that's conservative. I'm going to look at that annuity as another bond, because basically that's a 4% return on a $700,000 bond. Maybe, okay, 4 point something. So if I think of that other $700,000 there, if it's a long-term annuity, then you've got a much larger percentage in fixed income. And I further asked him if he was meeting all of his spending needs. This guy isn't a client. He was a teacher at my son's school that I got to know. My son's 30 years old now, so this was from his high school. I said, I think you're great. I think you're in good shape. The problem's going to come in another few months when things go lower. And you could look at that $1.2 million down at $1 million, and you're going to want to walk outside and throw up in your front yard. You are. It's going to feel awful. That's the moment when you don't want to do anything either, because it will pass. But this is the responsibility of investing. Think about the long term. The money's got to serve you. This is to meet your long-term goals. This is not to outsmart the people on CNBC or your brother-in-law who will tell you about his hot new stock hit that really he just made a killing because he bought Bitcoin or some stupid thing like Bitcoin. And he's going to make you feel stupid for not owning Bitcoin. Don't feel stupid. You're the one retired in Tennessee playing golf 3 days a week. This is not bad. So try not to do emotional things and don't try and script this. The big script is working. I'm done. The big script is working. America is working. Corporate expansion is working. That's why we invest. We believe that America will grow and corporate America will continue to flourish, and we want to own some of it, and we'll let our money compound over time.
Dan, I want to bring you in on the politics of inflation. So last year when Chair Powell was testifying before Congress, a lot of people wanted to know, why isn't the Fed doing more? That was really before the more aggressive rate increases. At what point do you expect that to change? And are you surprised that we haven't seen more pressure yet on the Fed from elected officials to say, hey, wait a minute? I mean, just looking through the questions here, a lot of the questions are about, why isn't the Fed taking more time to see the impacts of these increases? Are you surprised that we haven't heard more pushback yet on the Fed because, that was the most aggressive pace of rate increases in 40 years last year?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been an attitude, there's certainly been exceptions, but an overall attitude of giving the Fed the space it needs to give the economy its medicine. There are the progressives, mainly progressives, who have said this is coming in too fast, that perhaps the push would raise unemployment among specific elements of the society that would be more concerned. We haven't really seen that as of yet, so that's been there. But I also think economic news and where it intersects with politics, so much of it is now our country's choose your own adventure story. If you are against the administration, then inflation is bothering you, and this is all their fault. If you're for the administration, well, this inflation is bothersome, but Republicans spent too, and this is all Putin's fault. So the economic impact is now driven, I think, so much by perception of who's making the decisions rather than the actual outcome. How long that lasts, though, as Michael points out, when people finally see that the credit card's maxed out and the kitty is empty, then they'll probably start to apportion blame.
Yeah, we're at 3.5% unemployment right now, so maybe there's not as much to be unhappy about. Michael, what's your take of this? How do you see the politics of inflation and the politics of tighter money playing out over the next year?
I feel like we're transitioning to that period in the cycle where we start to allocate blame. There's a period in these cycles where the Fed has had their margin, and now they're going to be the problem. And all you need now is Congress or that same row of no. You all saw them sitting there. No, we keep voting no. The row of no in Congress to say, we think the problem is this Fed, and we need to audit the Fed, and we need to monitor the balance sheet of the Fed. And this Fed has way too much power and independence. Yeah, because you guys have done such a good job at managing your budget. We should actually switch you over and hear what you think about the central bank. But I expect that that's going to be the next step in the politics of that. They'll come under attack, and Jay Powell's going to come under attack pretty hard again. I think Janet Yellen will too. One of Doug Cass's surprises this year, hedge fund manager down in Palm Beach, he writes these wild things. He thinks that Yellen and Powell could be out by the end of this year. I don't, but
yeah.
Hey,
Powell was just confirmed to a 4-year term. I think he got 80 votes in the Senate, which you typically only see a vote like that these days to adjourn the Senate. And that was in May of last year. So that'll be interesting if we get there. Sticking with inflation, Dan, I want to ask you about China. And there's a question here from the audience. Given China's softening stance on its COVID-0 policy, do you think we'd see another inflationary spike as Chinese citizens resume normal spending behavior?
Mm-hmm. I think we can see that. I think we have to get through, though, this first period of reopening. We are seeing a humanitarian crisis there that has come about from both the arrogance of their feelings that they did not need to use Western vaccines or pharmaceuticals, as well as, I think, a sense that in the authoritarian regime, no one wants to deliver bad news up the chain of command. So you're going to have a longer process. I think you're going to see, particularly through the New Year holiday, where people are returning home to their families. It's going to push the rural healthcare system to the brink. And I think the Chinese economic story could actually probably get worse before it gets better. A lot of the questions, though, about what their demand bounce back looks like depends on so much of what the mood of the Chinese consumer is right now. And the tenor you hear from both the overhang of COVID-0, now the perception of demographic decline, questions about the economic future, there's larger questions I think you'll see not only of what the demand is, but how the regime deals with the first truly disappointed generation that they've had to deal with in some time. And that's going to be something that, beyond how they approach the economic stimulus, is also a political and security question as well. So to answer that question, yes, I do think you can't avoid some kind of impact with the world's largest economy or second largest economy reopening. That said, the headwinds they face are significant. I don't think it's going to be the type of bounce back that you saw in the United States.
Dan's an expert in China, by the way, and he studied in Shanghai, and he speaks Mandarin, and he has his master's degree in security studies from Georgetown with a focus on China. So I just want to say, when Dan talks about China, I listen a little more closely.
I mean, it's crazy to me because we were here almost exactly 3 years ago, and we were talking. This had really only shut down China at that point. Here we are 3 years later. It feels like almost every other country in the world has managed through this, and different jurisdictions went about this very differently. Australia was able to completely lock down. The question here, though, Dan, is there any country that managed COVID well? Because even Australia, where you had very low mortality, the inflation, almost every country, maybe except for China and Japan, has seen inflation problems, and everybody managed COVID a little bit differently. Is there anybody that got COVID done right?
That is a good question. I think you look at it, you have to kind of have a hydra-headed answer of this, that Australia probably handled it best from a political standpoint, creating a unity government. Sweden was controversial at first in terms of a let-it-rip strategy, but others say that got it through faster. And then ultimately in the U.S., I think regardless of politics, you have to say that the Operation Warp Speed vaccine program was an international success compared to any others around the world. So it's hard to say there's one country that got it right. I think as policymakers and scholars look ahead at this, it's going to be understanding what menu different countries used in an unprecedented time and then applying those to whatever we do next time.
I want to ask President Harker, as Dan and I have been talking a lot. I do this podcast every week, and Dan is our political analyst and comes on every week. So we've been doing this for 6 years. I learn all of what he has to say about China. Okay, so one of the things he's been explaining to me about China is that Xi Jinping has a different agenda. He's not interested in economic growth. In fact, he'll throw economic growth under the bus. He has this ideal China plan. He's shut down Hong Kong. Jack Ma has got his picture on milk cartons. They don't care. It's not. That's figurative because they wouldn't allow his picture on the right. But what does it mean to our economy when China is no longer the growth engine of the world and says they have no intention of becoming a real economic partner with anybody?
So what we're hearing now is what you're all hearing. The not reshoring, some little reshoring, but it's just the re-engineering of supply chains. And who are the big winners? So this is going to happen, right? The private sector is going to react, and they are reacting to this situation. And so they're moving things. They're moving things to South Korea, Vietnam, some to India. Mexico seems, lots of data shows that Mexico is moving pretty quickly. And potentially some areas in Africa are starting to see companies moving. So it's going to take time, right? As you said, supply chains are very complex. They're going to take time, but it will happen. The private sector will adjust to this behavior. What does that mean for the U.S.? Well, the supply chains were that way for a reason. They were optimal, right?
Right.
I mean, companies were optimizing the supply chains. To move somewhere else, by definition, is not optimal yet. But that doesn't mean it can't be over time, but it's going to take time. And that's why I think we're going to get, it's going to take a little bit of a hit on growth for a while to make that happen. How much, it's hard to estimate that right now, because it's hard to know how difficult it will be in China, whether this will be sustained. I mean, as you say, it might, and I'm not a China, but there's still so much uncertainty there. But clearly, companies are rethinking everything right now. But at the same time, when you talk to some people, I was talking to a company recently, a contact, he said, well, it's a problem in China, but they like our product and we're hanging in there because it's still a very attractive consumer product, so they're not going to leave. Individual firms are going to make these decisions. We'll have to just see how this plays out. So how it affects our forecast is just a lot of uncertainty around GDP, because we just don't know what the overall impact will be.
Is the U.S. the world's growth engine now? Are we the growth in the global economic fabric? Doesn't feel like it.
No, but I think that some other countries, back to your point though, with rule of law and so forth, are critically important. And it's up to those countries to decide whether they're going to be part of that growth engine or not. And that's not our job, right? It's the job of those governments. But there will be a bit of a hit if you just think of it as you're moving from one equilibrium and supply chain to another. There's going to be a hit on growth.
So you mentioned this change in, because that has ramifications for inventory management too.
Absolutely.
If companies move from just-in-time inventory management to just-in-case, you want to have alternate suppliers, alternate vendors. That has ramifications, I would think, for inflationary pressures and for the Fed. And then, Pat, in your speech, you talked about structural labor shortages maybe being more common. So in the 1990s, early 2000s, we heard about the Great Moderation and this idea. There were these tailwinds that were helping the Fed to meet this mandate of low and stable inflation. To the extent that those tailwinds are turning into headwinds because of less friendly globalization, because of these demographic forces, what implications does it have for setting monetary policy if we're moving into not a higher inflationary regime, but a regime with higher inflationary pressures?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to step back again, and Dan is the expert in this, and I'm curious his reaction. But some of this is in our hands. Yes, there are demographic trends, right, that are clear. But we also are a nation of immigrants. We don't have to accept that we're going to have less than, the estimates vary, but roughly about 4 million workers shy of where we should be. If you add up the boomers who retire early, the people who tragically died of COVID, and 2+ million immigrants that aren't here because we shut it down.
Yes.
That's in our hands. It's not some act of God that came upon us. We collectively chose to do that. We can collectively choose to change it. And so it's part of this, the inflationary pressure, say, with respect to the labor market, we can fix. It's not impossible to fix. So yes, there's going to be increased inflationary pressures probably for a while as these things readjust. But again, I think they will adjust. So we're going to have to live with inflation. That's why we don't think it's going to come down to trend at least until 2025, and maybe it'll hover above for a little while too. But as long as we get close, as long as we keep moving in that right direction, I think that's what policy has to do, and that's what we're trying to do. And by the way, as an old operations management professor, the fact that supply chains are cool is great.
I am so glad, though, that you mentioned immigration, though, and the political challenge there. I'll add trade to that as well. We have taken two things that Washington could do that would very much help competitiveness and lower costs and inflation. Immigration, we have to let workers in, or otherwise, as I've told Michael, the other solution has an 18-year lead time. So we got to let workers in now. And then the other one is that on trade, I think both of those, immigration and trade, are areas where probably everyone in this room, any other room in America, we could get a 70% agreement on a solution for immigration and trade, and that just doesn't translate through into Washington. And that's, I think, a overhang that we still have from 2016 and just before, where the Trump victory changed how a lot of politicians think, the freedom they have on immigration and trade, and I think they have a lot more than they realize.
I'm still hung up on the speaker thing. Can we go back for 1 second? how does this work when they want to throw out McCarthy over one vote? How does he get this budget thing done? What's it going to take? And if somehow they throw him out, who do we get next?
That is a good question. And that was one of the reasons we went through 16 votes, is because there was no clear alternative. The ones you would actually say, Scalise, Stefanik, would they, though, want to inherit this position? Someone told me that I think McCarthy made the speakership so weak that no one else would want to have it as a poison chalice type position. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it's either that he is a martyr of some kind. He's willing to sacrifice his job to do something. It takes Republicans and Democrats who are willing to lose their primary or to come together in some way to figure an alternative. But I'm going to go back to a quote from a European politician, Jean-Claude Juncker. I don't know how many people remember him. He was from Luxembourg. He liked to tipple a little bit, so he had a way of telling the truth. And he said, "We know what we need to do. We just don't know how to get reelected after doing it."
Yeah.
So on the debt limit, you know, you in your opening remarks, you talked about how you think we could go off the, you know, past the point where we miss payments to Social Security retirees, or we're not able to pay our bills. But it sounded like you're suggesting in the end they will raise the debt limit.
I think they will, because it will be like, I imagine it happening again like the TARP vote did in 2008, that a vote fails, there is some kind of 48 or 72-hour default, or we call it extraordinary measures or something of that kind. But we enter a period where the markets respond. We see a spike in borrowing costs, you know, something like what they call it with the British, the stupidity margin or whatever I think they had it. They were calling that their borrowing costs went up because of that. And we're going to have something like that where I think there's a period of, I hate to say, going through the looking glass, as it were. The markets respond, and then they come back on some kind of deal or vote to undo the damage they've done once they've seen how that happens. I think that, though, follows a lot of that model of 2008, where there was the bailout package. They voted it down, the markets responded, and then they came back. You know, there was, I think, you know, some Treasury secretaries on their knees in front of members of Congress, but I think we'll see something like that again.
So Michael, if you do that, you raise the risk, of course, of building in some premium, some non-payment on time premium into the Treasury market.
All right, the moron premium. That was what they called it.
And so do you think that will be I mean, if you're concerned about government spending, I would think you would want to take steps to keep debt service costs for the country low. Do you think this argument that, well, actually, you know, you look at what happened in the gilt market crisis in the UK at the end of September, do you think that would be persuasive to some of these Republicans who want to try to use the debt limit as a leverage to cut spending, that actually you could end up spending more money if you don't take care of the bills that you've already agreed to incur?
I can't see that some of these folks have any higher priority other than their own grandstanding on whatever issue it might be. I mean, this is a third rail issue. I couldn't believe they did it in 2011. I watched, I listened to those debates, and I got into a shouting match on CNBC with Rick Santelli, by the way. I said, somehow they've got to come up with a compromise, and he starts screaming at me, "No compromise!" I said, do you understand how our government works? These people are here, and they figure out how to make sausage. And yet, the U.S. debt was downgraded to AA. You all know that Johnson & Johnson and Microsoft have higher rated debt than the United States government. I mean, that really kind of bugs me. I mean, I understand but it still bugs me. They shouldn't have anything higher than I mean, how does that happen? I think they'll go too far. It is beyond my imagination how in the hell they're going to let themselves do it, but they sure seem to get in this frenzy. And when they went to 16 votes, they sent a clear message to Kevin McCarthy. we will do it and we don't care, and damn the torpedoes. I have a question for you. You've been writing about the Fed for how many years?
5 years now.
That wasn't the question. Okay, 5 years. And you talked to
You wasted your shot.
all sorts. That was it. That was my question. It's a two-parter then. So
I'm familiar with those.
usually asking them, I know. What is it when the general public misses about the Fed? What don't we get? When you talk to the Fed and you hear a message, what's the frustration and difficulty with getting the message through, and what doesn't the public understand?
I don't think there's a frustration. I mean, to the extent that people can't understand what's happening with an important set of policy, it creates an opportunity for the reporters who are trying to explain what's happening. But I would say, I think last year there was a lot of uncertainty around, how fast the Fed was going to move. Everybody was, for better or worse, winging it, right? This has been an unprecedented period of time ever since we were here 3 years ago. So I think obviously there are a lot of misconceptions, or there's just difficulty understanding why people are doing what they're doing, and that creates an opportunity for reporters to, break news and to hold policymakers accountable for what decisions they're making.
Yeah, but I read your stuff. This is a must read. If you're in my business, you have to absolutely read his column every day. You read Nick Timrose, you have to read it. Not once did I read Winging It in any of your. When you hear Winging It, what do you write? I mean, seriously, when you hear something like that, how do you?
Well, Winging It's my own kind of editorializing here. If you go back to the interest rate projections that Pat and his colleagues put out every quarter, just as an example, not to pick on you all. But in March of last year, I think there was one participant around the table that thought interest rates would get to above 3% by the end of last year. And if you look at, they call this the dot plot, but it's a matrix of where every participant or everybody who attends the FOMC meetings puts down where they think interest rates will be under appropriate policy. Right. And we ended last year between 4.25 and 4.5. That's where we are now. If you look at the submissions in March, the y-axis stopped out at 4%. So you all raised interest rates above where even the paper stopped, and so it was a year that, especially after the war in Ukraine, no one could have predicted. Right. Very high uncertainty, and. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So, I think the misconception that the public has is we have some secret data or some secret sauce that nobody else has.
Oh, don't tell me
and so
that.
The reason we're not telling you that we're going to take rates above 4% is because we know something that they don't know. No, we're all living in the same world with the same data. I mean, this is really important. Yeah, we swim in a sea of data, but so do you, right? And so it's how you analyze the data and then what policy model in your head you put on top of that. And this is where, traditionally there are hawks and doves in the Fed, right? And people come in. I put myself squarely in the corner of being an eagle, a Philadelphia eagle.
Oh, they get to one Super Bowl and you listen to this.
I see myself more as I don't like the hawk-dove thing. I'm a pragmatist. Look at the data squarely in the eye, and then look at the risks, and then balance the risks. That's what we do. And in the case of what Nick is saying, nobody saw all these things happen. It was hard to put into your risk forecast that Putin was going to do the unthinkable, right? But we all knew that. It all hit us. So that, if there's a misconception, it's down in the bowels of the Martin Building or the Eccles Building in Washington. We've got this secret data that nobody else has. We don't. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes their stuff, we hear about it when you hear about it. There is nothing that you don't know. It's just how we how we analyze it.
So, Pat, I want to go back to something you said when you were answering my first question, because I see the question coming up here about the lags in monetary policy, and this idea, the analogy of kind of going slowly in a dark room. What would you need to see to say, you know what, and I'm not suggesting this would be the case at your next meeting, but
Yeah.
you know, you said at some point you might not raise interest rates anymore. So what would you need to see to say, okay, maybe we can take a meeting off? Doesn't mean that you're
Yeah.
not going to raise interest rates anymore.
Yeah.
But you know, this idea of slowing things down after another 25 basis points increase, I mean, would you be comfortable saying, you know what, maybe after this next meeting, if the data do X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
and you can tell me what X, Y, and Z would
Yeah,
be?
and so let me put the data in two categories, hard and soft. I think if there's a mistake I made, and I'll only speak for myself, is I did not listen enough to the soft data we were getting on when inflation was transient, or what people were saying it was transient. We were hearing from my board of directors, we were hearing from our regional contacts that, nah, this seems longer, you know? But it takes a while for that to show up in the hard data, right? And I think if there was a mistake I made, it was I didn't weigh that soft data enough. And we started to do that, as you're saying, in the fall of 21. Fall of 21. We started to really see that come to fruition. But we were early on, as Michael said, in saying, you know, this doesn't feel transient. It does feel. I don't want to make that mistake this time in the other direction, right? So I want to make sure that what we're here, so it's both the hard data, and it's not just the headline number, it's also what we saw when it started, right? Inflation was used cars, then it spread out. Now we're going to start seeing it coming back. So that's what we want to start to see, is that all these goods and services start to come back in terms of the distribution of inflation. But I also want to listen to the soft data. And what I'm hearing now, why I'm supportive of ramping down the 25s, is every one of our contacts is saying, yeah, this seems like it's slowing down. You really need to take that into account.
The soft data, for example, there's a Institute for Supply Management, purchasing managers are surveyed every month on business conditions. And for the non-manufacturing index that was out a couple of weeks ago, I'll ask Jen here to unlock the screen so I can get back to your questions. But it showed that new orders for non-manufacturing for the services sector were down quite a bit. I mean, is that the sort of thing that you're talking about here?
Well, there's that, and then the beauty of the Fed with the 12 reserve banks, we're out and about literally talking to business leaders all the time, and community leaders and community organizers. And you're starting to hear, you start to put the plural of data, anecdote is not data, you know, as Solo said. But again, as you start to take this into account, and you combine that with the survey data that is whether at the national level like the ISM or our own Manufacturing Business Outlook survey, others, you're starting to paint a picture here that things are slowing down and we should, as a result, start to slow down our increases.
So the question here that I was trying to get to is, with the lag time it takes for interest rate hikes to be fully felt in the economy, why does the Fed not feel a greater need to assess the full effects of the hikes they've already implemented before raising rates much more? I mean, would you, I'm re-asking the question, would you support skipping a meeting at some point? Is there something?
Possibly at some point, but I still think we need to get above 5, our forecast. But again, the forecast could change relative to the data. But let's get above 5 and sit there for a while. And, you know, if inflation is really coming down, you know, if it is a straight line instead of being bumpy, I think it's going to be bumpy too, but I could be wrong. So if inflation is really coming down quickly, then yeah, you could consider pausing, but I'm not at this point seeing that. I think we just need to keep doing 25s, get above 5, and then see where we are.
And to get even further into hypotheticals, I mean, if inflation comes down quite a bit, then the inflation-adjusted interest rate, or the real rate, will be going up.
Yeah.
And at some point, I would think there would be a real rate that feels unduly restrictive, or that would be historically very restrictive. What are you looking for in terms of the stance of real rates? Is there a real rate that you think would be, appropriately restrictive? How high is too high in terms of, 2.5% real rate that would just be providing a necessary restriction on the economy.
Yeah, I don't think we need to be, at this point, overly restrictive. I think we need to be restrictive, but we don't have to go really high. I think if we're seeing it is working, it's starting to work. So why would we try to get, really put clamps down on the economy and really risk losing the good things we have going, like the labor market? I just don't see doing that. But we've got to get to a restrictive stance, but we don't have to go wildly restrictive.
I guess the question, to bring Dan back in, we were talking about the debt limit before, and Republicans are trying to use this to get spending cuts. Apart from how this standoff gets resolved, how do you see the prospect that Congress actually takes action to cut spending this year? Because you could make an argument. I mean, you're not hearing the sort of Tea Party arguments that you were hearing 10 years ago when we had the 2011 standoff, but you could make the argument that if you can't cut spending in the current environment, when can you? So do you think there's a prospect, not necessarily on the debt limit, but on the appropriations bills, the annual government funding bills that usually get passed in the fourth quarter of the year, do you think there's a chance we could actually see negotiated spending cuts, something like the sequester, the across-the-board spending curbs that Congress implemented 10 years ago?
The biggest barrier I see to those right now is that when those were implemented, they were done in a way, and the only way you could get agreement was that they applied equally to defense and domestic spending. I don't see among Democrats or Republicans right now any appetite to cut defense spending. I could even see if not next year, the year after that, we could be looking at $1 trillion defense budgets when you pull everything together. And that, I think, is a pressure on spending that you're not going to be able to use those traditional mechanisms of dollar for dollar defense and domestic cuts that have been the traditional secret sauce for those kind of spending issues in the past. I think it's really much more of a brinksmanship and digging in. And I would also advise people that if you really want to get into it, go to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They have a simulator where you can actually play around with these various programs and see just how hard it is to actually get this down and understand that a lot of what you hear are spending gimmicks rather than real spending cuts.
Yeah, I mean, the Penn-Wharton budget model, you can do
that's
similar
another one
things.
too.
Yeah.
A question here for Michael. Are we looking at interest rates staying elevated, i.e. back to normal, for the foreseeable future? Is it fair to say the party is over for equity returns because they've been because interest rates have been in the basement for the last 10 plus years?
You know, I really like staying employed. It's the easiest way to pay my food bill. We've had a wind at our back for over a decade of these low interest rates, and that breeze has shifted. And that the question then becomes, all right, if you can't have free money, and we have money that with a reasonable price, what's a reasonable profit? Okay. So when you look at what's going to drive profit growth, if we can see earnings growth over the next 5 years of 5% per year, and you get a 2% dividend and we have a 7% return, I think that's kind of reasonable. When you say that, that's the fundamental, that's the foundation that seems to make sense. What you have layered over that, though, are all the emotional responses of investors, plus all of these algorithms and computer trading things. They're whipping things around. You know that there are computer trading programs that trade based on the words in the Fed statement, in the words whatever he said in his speech today went through every AI program, and if there was a word in there that they didn't expect, it triggered buy and sell orders today and added to the volume. So, promise. I mean, that's what's happening on these days where you see stocks open up 1,000 points or down 1,000 points. That's not Fred and Ethel out there going, oh, today I'm buying McDonald's, right? That's so beyond all of that noise, where do you see fundamental value that can be driven in a sustainable way? That's what I think we get back to. And I think that that rate of increase that we've seen over the last 10 years anyway is going to be lower because the cost of money's higher.
No, but it does raise, I think, a longer-term issue. If you step back, you know, the day-to-day volatility, the month-to-month volatility is hard to predict, right? But if you look at the longer run, there is a big question. I think there's a question that the economics profession has more broadly of what's it going to look like. You know, we're going to get through this. I agree. We're going to get through this. But are we going to go back to, let's stick with real rates, to where we were, low real rates? Because there were fundamental drivers, demographics and so forth, that were driving that. What's really changed? I mean, yes, there was a war, there's a pandemic and so forth. That's now in the rearview mirror. What does it look like when we get far enough away from that stuff? We don't know exactly. Is something fundamentally changed from where we were? Or are we in this situation? Again, demographics being the most notable thing you can put out there, that's going to change the picture of low rates that we had before all this happened. I don't know the answer to that exactly, but I know, and I don't think anybody has a firm handle on that, but it is a good thing to think about for the longer run investors.
It comes back still to when you consider what's GDP growth and that number of workers, growth in workers and growth in productivity.
That's it.
We don't have workers. We got to make donuts, folks. We can have donut making machines, but somebody's got to stand there and pour the bag of flour in.
Right.
Right? Got to do it. And we don't have those workers. We need those workers. You want to have a growing GDP. Productivity's been in the tank for a long time.
Yeah.
We can see gains through technology and everything. We need workers.
I agree.
Well, on that point of consensus, I will turn the stage over to Dave.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming today. Tim and I, our boss / mother, wanted to be here today, but unfortunately, her flight was delayed in getting back from Vietnam. She took her first vacation since our father passed away. So, and despite Tim and my best efforts, we were not successful in burning the company to the ground. So, all is good. Nick, thank you so much for moderating. It is always a privilege to have the Wall Street Journal here. President Harker, always an honor. Thank you very much. And Michael and Dan, thank you for the information and all the valuable insight that you bring to the table. I'd like to thank the University of Delaware, the Lerner College of Business, the Center, and Susan Sherry to help put this together. From Lyons Companies, Jen Miller, thank you very much. This is always a year in the making, believe it or not. And all of you are going to receive an email. There's a short survey. If you wouldn't mind, please filling it out. It helps us in preparing every year to make sure that you all receive the best information possible during this event. And last but not least, I'd like to comment on my younger brother, Tim. If you would like to learn more about his charm and good looks, there's a recent publication that he just finished. It's called Spare. Please go ahead and enjoy yourself. Thank you. And the bar is back over this way. Thank you.